There is something deeply telling about the moments right after a major explosion. Not in the smoke, not in the rubble, and not even in the body count peak, but in the silence that follows. That careful, deliberate silence from the people who are supposed to be giving you answers. We are living through one of those moments right now, and if you have been paying attention, really paying attention, you already sense that the official narrative forming around this event does not quite sit right. It feels rehearsed, it feels prepackaged, and that instinct you have, that quiet discomfort pulling at the back of your mind, that is not paranoia, that is pattern recognition. That is what happens when you have watched this playbook run enough times that your brain starts recognizing the opening moves before the game is even fully set up. Because here is what decades of geopolitical observation have taught me. The most consequential explosions in modern history are almost never what they are initially presented to be. The cause is almost always more complex, the timing is almost always more deliberate, and the beneficiary, us, that critical question of who gains from this, is almost always hiding in plain sight, dressed in the language of tragedy and sympathy. Today, we are going to strip all of that away. We are going to go layer by layer, the way you peel an onion, until we get to the core of what is actually happening and why it matters not just to the region where this occurred, but to you, sitting in the United States, watching your gas prices, watching your foreign policy position shift, watching your country be slowly redirected by forces that most news anchors either cannot see or are not allowed to name. And I want to plant something in your mind right now, a critical realization that I am going to fully unpack in the final third of this conversation, and it is this. The investigation into what caused this explosion may actually matter far less than the investigation into why this explosion is being investigated the way it is. Hold on to that, we will come back to it, and when we do, everything you thought you understood about this event will reorganize itself into something far more coherent and far more unsettling. So let us begin at the beginning, not the official beginning, not the press conference beginning, the real beginning. We are living in an era of what I would call managed destabilization. This is not a phrase I use lightly or dramatically. It is a precise description of a very specific geopolitical strategy that has been employed by major power centers, primarily Anglo-American financial and intelligence structures across several decades and across multiple continents. The strategy is elegant in its brutality and devastating in its efficiency. You do not need to invade a country if you can make that country ungovernable from within. You do not need to bomb infrastructure if you can create conditions where infrastructure destroys itself, through neglect, through sabotage, through the cascading failures that come when a society is under sustained economic and political pressure. And when something does explode, whether it is a pipeline, a port, a weapons depot, or a government building, the first move is always the same. Flood the information space with noise. Create a fog of competing explanations. Make the public feel that the truth is simply too complex to ever be known, and in that fog, the real architects of the event walk away clean. Now, what we are seeing with the current blast and its investigation is a textbook example of this fog machine at work. The investigators are examining possible causes. Think about that phrase for a moment. Possible causes, not probable causes based on evidence, not confirmed causes based on forensic findings. Possible causes. That language alone tells you something crucial about where this investigation is being directed and, more importantly, where it is being steered away from. When official bodies use language this vague in the immediate aftermath of a major incident, it is not because the situation is genuinely unclear. It is because clarity has been strategically deferred. And deferred clarity in geopolitics almost always serves the interests of the party with the most to lose from the truth coming out quickly. To understand why this matters, we have to look at the broader strategic map, the chessboard, if you will, because no explosion in a strategically significant region ever happens in a vacuum. Every piece on that chessboard is connected to every other piece, and what appears to be an isolated industrial accident in one corner of the board often turns out to be a calculated sacrifice or a calculated strike that reshapes the entire geometry of power across the board. We have seen this with Nord Stream, we have seen this with the Beirut port explosion in 2020, where 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate went up in a blast that killed over 200 people, wounded thousands, and left the Lebanese state barely functional, an event that, to this day, has produced no credible official conclusion, despite the fact that the evidence points in several very specific directions that Lebanese authorities have been legally and politically prevented from pursuing. We have seen this pattern in Yemen, in Syria, in Ukraine, places where explosions become geopolitical instruments, where the bomb is not just a physical event, but a signal, a message, and a recalibration of the political landscape. The question you should be asking right now, and I genuinely want you to think about this and share your perspective in the comments, is this. At what point does the consistent failure to reach conclusions in major explosion investigations stop being incompetence and start being policy? Because let us be honest with each other, these investigators are not amateurs. The forensic technology available to modern states is extraordinary. Satellite imagery, chemical signature analysis, electronic intercepts, financial forensics, the tools available to serious investigators in 2025 are more sophisticated than anything we have ever had in human history, and yet, mysteriously, when it comes to the explosions that matter most geopolitically, these tools somehow fail to produce clear conclusions. The investigation drags on. Key witnesses become unavailable, evidence chains are broken, and eventually public attention moves on, and the event is quietly filed under complex situation or ongoing investigation and never meaningfully revisited. This is not accident, this is architecture. But to understand why this architecture exists and who built it, we have to step back even further and look at what is actually at stake in the broader geopolitical theater right now. Because we are not living through a normal period of international relations. We are living through what historians will almost certainly describe as a structural pivot, a moment where the unipolar world order that the United States constructed after 1991 is cracking under the weight of its own contradictions, and the multipolar architecture that Russia, China, Iran, and an increasing number of global South nations are building is beginning to harden into something real and something durable. And it is precisely in this transition, this dangerous, unstable, unpredictable transition, that explosions become most useful as geopolitical tools. Think about what an explosion can accomplish that a diplomatic memo cannot. It can eliminate a key figure, it can destroy critical infrastructure in a way that creates economic dependency, it can destabilize a government by making it appear incapable of protecting its own people. It can serve as a false flag, an event designed to be blamed on an adversary in order to justify a military or economic response that was already planned and already desired. The explosion is not just kinetic. It is narrative, it is the spark that lights a predetermined fuse of political consequence. And understanding whose hand was on the match requires you to look not at the debris field, but at the political calendar, the economic leverage map, and the intelligence relationship between the key actors in the vicinity. Here is where the United States comes directly into this picture, and this is the part that most American commentators will dance around but never quite say directly. The United States, through its intelligence apparatus and its network of allied intelligence services, has been one of the most consistent and sophisticated practitioners of what the CIA historically called covert action, the use of non-attributable force to achieve political objectives. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. From Operation Ajax in Iran in 1953 to the mining of Nicaraguan harbors in the 1980s, to the documented support for armed groups across the Middle East and Central Asia, the use of explosions, literal and metaphorical, as instruments of policy is deeply embedded in the American national security state's operational toolkit. And what makes the current moment particularly interesting is that this toolkit is being deployed at a time when American power is simultaneously overextended and under existential challenge. Because the United States today is not the United States of 1991 or even 2001. The fiscal situation is deteriorating at a pace that would alarm any serious economist who is willing to look at the numbers honestly. The dollar's reserve currency status, the foundation of American geopolitical leverage for the last 80 years, is being quietly but systematically undermined by the BRICS nations' shift toward bilateral trade settlements in local currencies and the development of alternative payment architectures that bypass the SWIFT system. The military-industrial complex is discovering, painfully, in the plains of Ukraine and in the waters of the Red Sea, that the weapon systems that looked so impressive on paper and in congressional budget justifications do not perform with the same dominance against adversaries who have invested 30 years in developing asymmetric countermeasures. And domestically, the social fabric is stretched in ways that make it increasingly difficult for the national security establishment to maintain the public consensus necessary to sustain aggressive foreign policy postures. All of this creates a very specific kind of desperation, And desperate powers throughout history have always been the most willing to reach for the most dangerous tools available, which brings us back to the explosion we are discussing and to that critical realization I asked you to hold. I want you to think about something and genuinely reflect on this because I think it is one of the most important questions of our current moment. When a major explosion occurs in a strategically sensitive location and the investigation is immediately characterized by vagueness, bureaucratic language, and the deliberate absence of urgency, who does that serve? Not the victims, not the communities affected, not the countries trying to understand their security environment. It serves the party that needs time, the party that needs the forensic trail to cool, the party that needs the geopolitical consequences of the event to unfold before attribution becomes politically viable. And in the current global environment, we have a very limited number of actors with the capability, the motive, and the track record to be in that position. Now, to understand the full depth of what is happening, we need to talk about something that almost nobody in mainstream American commentary is willing to talk about directly, which is the degree to which the Western financial system, not the Western military, not even Western intelligence, but the Western financial system, has become the primary driver of these destabilization strategies. Because what you see when you trace the money behind many of these incidents, the financing of the groups, the insurance structures around the infrastructure, the commodities positions held by certain financial entities in the days before and after major explosions, is a pattern that suggests these events are not purely military or intelligence operations. They are, in a very real sense, financial operations with kinetic components. They are moves on a chessboard where the pieces are governments and armies, but the players are entities sitting in financial centers who profit from volatility, who have structured positions that gain value when certain commodities spike, when certain currencies collapse, when certain governments lose stability. This is the layer of the onion that almost never gets discussed in public, because discussing it requires naming specific institutions and specific individuals in ways that create legal and professional risk for anyone in mainstream media. But here, in this format, in this conversation, I think it is essential to at least point the lens in the right direction, even if we cannot always read every detail of what it reveals. Because the American public, particularly the segment of the American public that is watching this video right now, deserves to have this lens pointed honestly. You are the people who are going to be affected by the downstream consequences of these events. Your sons and daughters are the ones who wear the uniform when these geopolitical games require a human sacrifice. Your taxes are the ones that fund the operations and the aftermath. Your cost of living is the one that spikes when energy markets react to carefully orchestrated disruptions. You have a right to the fullest possible picture, even when that picture is incomplete and even when the institutions that should be giving it to you have decided that your access to that picture is not in their interest. And now I want to come back to that critical realization I planted at the beginning because I promised we would unpack it fully, and here is where it becomes most clear. I said that the investigation into what caused this explosion may matter far less than the investigation into why this explosion is being investigated the way it is. Here is what I mean by that. In any explosion investigation, there are always two simultaneous processes happening. The first is the forensic process, the physical collection and analysis of evidence, the reconstruction of the event sequence, the identification of the causative mechanism. The second is the narrative process, the simultaneous construction of a story about what happened, who is responsible, and what the appropriate response is. And in every major geopolitically significant explosion of the last 3 decades, the narrative process has consistently moved faster and with far more certainty than the forensic process. People are blamed before the evidence is analyzed. Responses are demanded before conclusions are reached. And by the time the forensic process catches up, if it ever does, the narrative has already done its work, the policy has already been made, the public opinion has already been shaped, the geopolitical consequence has already been locked in. This is what I mean when I say the investigation into how it is being investigated reveals more than the investigation itself, because the speed of the narrative, the identity of the sources being given the most prominent platform, the specific alternative explanations being most aggressively dismissed, these are all fingerprints. Not physical fingerprints in the debris, but political and institutional fingerprints in the information environment. And those fingerprints, if you know what you are looking for, point just as clearly to a responsible party as any physical evidence could. So I want to leave you with a final question, and I want this to really sit with you, because I think it is the most important question any thoughtful American can be asking right now. If the pattern holds, if this investigation follows the same trajectory as Nord Stream, as Beirut, as every other major explosion in a strategically significant location in recent history, and if we arrive 12 months from now with no definitive conclusion, with the event quietly archived in the folder of unresolved geopolitical mysteries, what does that tell you about the system that is supposed to be giving you truth? And what does it tell you about what you need to build for yourself in terms of your own analytical framework, your own information sources, your own capacity to read these events without relying on institutions that have demonstrated repeatedly that clarity is not their primary product? The smoke from this explosion will clear, the rubble will be cleaned up, the victims will be mourned, at least by those who loved them, but the geopolitical architecture that this event was designed to reinforce, or to disrupt, or to reshape, that will remain. And the people who built it and the people who benefit from it will continue to operate quiet and confident in the knowledge that most people will move on before the full picture ever becomes visible. Do not be most people. Stay with the picture. Ask the harder questions and share your thoughts below. Because in these moments of managed confusion, the most important thing we can do is refuse to be confused alone.